Today we'll be looking at 4 cases that were first launched on the channel in 2022. But these are not just random cases selected by me. These are the 4 cases that had the highest percentage like ratio after 60 days of being launched. The first case is from 1880s USA. Matilda Smith was born in Byram Township, Sussex County, New Jersey, on the 20th of June 1868, but despite being named Matilda, she was always known as Tilly. She lived with her family in extremely poor circumstances and received little education. Despite this, she grew up to be a pleasant and polite young lady. In 1886, she found employment as a kitchen maid at the Centenary Collegiate Institute in Hackettstown in New Jersey, which was some 50 miles west of New York City. This was a good position for Tilly, as although the work was hard, the institute provided her with accommodation. There were, however, some strict rules which all employees of the institute had to abide by, and although they were considered to be for the benefit of the staff, they were not always adhered to. Female employees were allowed out in their free time, but they were all required to have returned by 10 p.m. Anyone who needed to stay out beyond that hour would have to seek consent from the matron, and if they returned without having received the matron's consent, they'd be refused entry and have to find an alternative place to sleep. Tilly had made arrangements to meet her friends, Annie Van Sickle and sisters Mary and Agnes Wright, on the evening of Thursday, the 8th of April 1886. She knew that she would probably not return before 10 p.m. and did not want to ask permission from the matron to be allowed to stay out late. After all, it was a weekday, and her request would almost certainly be declined. She decided to ask for janitor if he would be able to let her back into the institute after the permitted hour. His name was James Titus, a somewhat quiet character. He was born in Hackettstown on the 6th of March 1857 and was married with a small child. He had worked at the institute for more than 11 years and was aware of all the strict regulations that were imposed on the staff, and it was not the first time that one of the young female employees had asked him for assistance in getting back into the institute after the doors had been locked. He was not allowed to break the rules, so told Miss Smith that he could not help her and that she would have to request permission from the matron. However, Tilly did not request permission, and after she had finished work on the 8th of April 1886, she left the institute and made her way unaccompanied to Main Street in Hackettstown, where she had arranged to meet her friends. Together they went to the entertainment hall to see a show. There they met 2 young gentlemen named Harry Herring and Charles Munich. They both worked as salesmen and were staying in a nearby hotel. When the show ended, the 4 young ladies walked along Main Street, accompanied by their 2 new acquaintances. Shortly afterwards, the sisters Mary and Agnes Wright went home, which meant that Tilly and her friend Annie were left in the company of Harry Herring and Charles Munich. Quite a few people were out that night, including a young man named Fred Weedy, who Tilly had previously courted. He was with his friend named Jess Baggott. Tilly and Frank spoke for a short while before she said goodbye to Annie and made her way back to the institute, accompanied by Charles Munich. The following morning, Friday the 9th of April 1886, a gentleman named Mr. John White was out walking his dog very close to the institute when he made a macabre discovery, the body of a young lady. He immediately contacted the authorities, and the body was identified to be Miss Tilly Smith, the young kitchen maid who worked at the Centenary Collegiate Institute. News of this horrifying crime soon spread throughout Hackettstown, and people wondered who could have committed such a terrible act. Her body was transferred to the mortuary, where Dr. J.S. Cook conducted an autopsy. He discovered that the cause of death had been strangulation. He also revealed that she had been outraged, and according to Dr. Cook, by more than one person. The doctor added that she had struggled valiantly to fend off her attacker. The people of Hackettstown were very anxious that the perpetrator or perpetrators were brought to justice, and the newspapers were eager to report on any new developments in the investigation. There was dust found on Tilly's dress, which led the police to think that the assault had probably taken place in the barn, which was a short distance from where the body had been found. But why she had been placed in the field, close to the institute, remained a mystery. There were no signs that she had been dragged, so they presumed that she must have been carried. Harry Herring and Charles Munich were arrested. They had both been seen with Tilly that night, and witnesses confirmed that they had seen Charles Munich walking with her in the direction of the institutes. However, both men denied that they had anything to do with the murder of Miss Smith. Charles Munich told the detectives that he had escorted Tilly to the gates of the institutes and that they arrived about 10 minutes past 10, by which time the door had been locked. He told the investigating officers that he had offered to pay for a room for her at the hotel where he was staying, but she told him that that would not be necessary, and instead she bid him good night and walked around the side of the building. The police held the two men for a few days, but witnesses had seen them both drinking at 11 o'clock in the bar at the American Hotel, and this meant that they would not have had enough time to have committed the murder. A $1,000 reward was offered for any information that may lead to finding the person or persons responsible for the terrible crime. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was also hired to assist with the investigation. New Jersey Chief Detective Bob Haggerty suspected that the janitor, Mr. James Titus, was responsible for the murder. He was surprised that he had not already been arrested. Detective Haggerty believed that he had opened the door for the young lady on the 8th of April so she would not get into trouble with the matron. He then propositioned her, and when she rejected his advances, he knocked her down, causing the marks that were found on her face. When she struggled, he strangled her and took her body to the field, where it was found the next morning. Even though there was no evidence to support this, the newspapers sensationalized Detective Haggerty's theory, and the public started to believe that the 29-year-old janitor, James Titus, had brutally ravaged and murdered Miss Tilly Smith, and the people and the press demanded justice. The newspapers also reported that Miss Tilly Smith had been buried in a pauper's grave. One named the New York World began asking for contributions in order that a memorial may be erected to commemorate her. They described it as a monument of virtue to commemorate a brave young lady who died in the defence of her honour. The press then all supported this campaign, and with no other suspects, continued with their efforts to persuade the authorities to arrest Mr. James Titus. They wrote that as he looked after the furnace in the basement, this could account for why there was dust on Tilly's clothes when she was found. He was also the person who would have let her in that night, and of course, Detective Haggerty believed he was the person responsible. A witness named Peter Mead came forward and told the police that on the night of the 8th of April, he had spoken to James Titus. He said that he had gone to the basement and that after a brief conversation, Mr. Titus spoke about Miss Smith in a very disrespectful manner, suggesting that she was not a young lady who portrayed the high moral values expected in the late 19th century. Mr. Peter Mead added that although he had planned to study late into the night, Mr. Titus had said that he should wait, as Miss Smith would soon be returning from her night out. The police believed Mr. Mead, and they did not investigate him to try and find out his motive for coming forward. If they had, they would have discovered that he was a somewhat strange and arrogant character. He was a student at the institute, but insisted that everyone referred to him as Reverend. He earned money by assisting Mr. Titus with his janitorial duties for a few hours each day. Following the brutal campaign in the press and the circumstantial evidence gathered by the police, on the 29th of April 1886, Mr. James Titus was arrested and charged with the assault and murder of Miss Tilly Smith. The trial began on the 28th of September 1886 in Belvedere, New Jersey, a town about 15 miles from where the crime took place. The courtroom was full, with many people gathered outside. Reporters were poised to write down everything that was said, and it seemed that the whole country was keen to read about the events that were unfolding. Many witnesses were called, but it was Peter Mead who provided the most sensational testimony. Once the reward money had been offered, he had started to take notes on apparent conversations that he had had with the defendant whilst he was working in the basement of the institute. He was an impressive witness and told the court that one night following the incident, they were together in the basement for most of the evening, but Mr. Titus was agitated and kept walking up and down the corridors. Mr. Mead said that he seemed more reserved than usual, but then he suddenly stood up and said, "Well, they may arrest me and they may hang me, but they can't destroy my soul." The defence had a difficult task, as the press had been particularly hostile towards Mr. James Titus, both before and after he had been arrested. They had written that he had acted improperly towards other young ladies who worked at the institutes, and this was mentioned by the prosecution. The prosecution, however, were unable to bring any witnesses who could confirm this. The defence described Mr. James Titus as someone who had always enjoyed an excellent reputation in the community, despite being a quiet and reserved character. They also outlined the other inconsistencies in the case. The prosecution had insisted that Tilly Smith had been murdered between 10:15 and 10:30 on the night of Thursday the 8th of April, but the doctors who carried out the post-mortem believed that the brutal crime had occurred at least 2 hours later, at some time in the early hours of the 9th of April. He knew every inch of the institute and the grounds, so if he had committed the crime, surely he would not just have left the body in a field. There were 2 cesspools covered with flagstones. It would have been very easy to conceal a body there, which may not have been discovered for months, even years. Miss Tilly Smith had not been working at the institute for very long, and she was known to be a temperamental young lady. Her parents lived apart in different areas of the country, so if she had suddenly gone missing, the matron would probably have presumed that she did not like the strict rules imposed on the staff, and may not have attempted to find out her whereabouts. The defendant had also been ill at the time, and had not wanted to leave the warmth of the basement. The prosecution told the court that Tilly was a charming and polite young lady who had been brought up in very poor circumstances, but after finding respectable employment in the Centenary Collegiate Institute, she was intent on improving her situation. The defence, however, tried to paint a very different picture. They described a young woman who portrayed very low social and moral standards, and who they believed had previously worked as a prostitute. They even produced witnesses who confirmed this. The trial lasted for nearly a month, and James Titus did not testify in his own defence. Many thought this to be a sign that he was indeed guilty. When the jury returned to deliver their verdict, they too considered him to be guilty. Before his sentence was passed, the judge asked him if he had anything to say, to which Mr. James Titus responded that he was innocent and had not committed the crime for which he had been convicted. The judge then sentenced him to death. The sentence was appealed, and it seemed that there were those who believed him to be not guilty. The newspapers had been very hostile towards him on their reporting of the case, and apart from Harry Herring and Charles Munich, the police had not seriously investigated anyone else. On the night that Miss Smith was murdered, she had spoken to Frank Weedy, who she had previously courted, and it was believed that he still had feelings for her. He had been seen with a young man named Jesse Baggett, but the police had never considered either of them to have been suspects in the crime. Before his execution dates, James Titus confessed to the murder of Tilly Smith. He claimed that they had been conducting an improper relationship for some time, and that they had been intimate again on the night of the 8th of April, after she had returned from the night out with her friends. He said that she then announced that she believed that she was with child, and that he was the father. This was followed by an argument in which he became so enraged he strangled her. Following his confession, his sentence was commuted to life in prison. The monument to the memory of Tilly Smith was unveiled on the 24th of November 1887 and sits beside her grave at the Hackettstown Union Cemetery. It was constructed following donations from local and national benefactors. On it is written, "She died in defence of her honour." James Titus served 19 years for the murder and was released on the 27th of December 1904. Sadly, his wife had died in the November of the same year. He carried on living in Hackettstown until the 18th of June 1952, when he died at the age of 95. He was then buried in the Union Cemetery, the same cemetery where Miss Tilly Smith had been laid to rest 66 years earlier. Many people believe that James Titus only made his confession to save himself from the gallows, and was in fact innocent of the crime for which he was found guilty. After his release, he never spoke about the case again. It is said that Tilly's ghost still walked through the college. There have been apparent sightings in the grounds, the halls, and the theatre. Mr. James Titus is the man who, according to history, murdered Miss Tilly Smith, but there is still much doubt about whether he actually did commit the horrible crime. We will probably never know for certain what actually happened on the night of the 8th of April 1886, or if justice was truly served. For the next case, we go to very early 20th century Monaco. Vere St Leger Gould was born on the 2nd of October 1853 in the beautiful town of Clonwell in County Tipperary in Ireland. He was raised in the coastal city of Waterford. He came from a relatively aristocratic family. His grandfather was a baronet and his grandmother was a daughter of the Earl of Kenmare. Vere's father was a magistrate in County Waterford, but his mother died when he was 17 years old, and this had quite an effect on him. Despite the family's distinguished lineage, they were not considered wealthy, although as a child, Vere's life was not particularly difficult. He received a good education and would spend much of his spare time sailing, hunting, and horse riding. When he became a young man, he would often be seen with people who were considered to be from a far more elite social circle. One pastime, which had become popular in Ireland with the upper and upper middle classes, was tennis. In 1877, the Fitzwilliam Lawn Tennis Club was founded, and in 1879, the first Irish Tennis Championships took place. Vere very much enjoyed the sport and became a very good player. Tennis was a way for him to meet Dublin's high society, and in 1879, when he was 25 years old, he entered the first ever Irish National Tennis Championship. He was very fit and athletic and was known for his powerful backhand and his great domination of the net. He won the tournament and became the Irish national champion. Following his success, he travelled to England to compete in the Wimbledon Championships. Again he played well, dropping only 2 sets on his way to the final. The final was considered a great occasion and took place on the 15th of July in front of a large crowd. There was great anticipation beforehand, as both players had been playing well and everyone was looking forward to a close match. Vere, however, lost to the Reverend John Hartley, who was the only vicar ever to have won the Wimbledon Tennis Championship. But he did not just lose. He lost in quite a disappointing manner, 3-0. After the defeat, rumours emerged that Vere, who was now a minor celebrity among those who followed tennis, had spent the night before the final drinking in the London pubs and had arrived to the final match suffering from a terrible hangover, which meant that he was unable to perform at a level anywhere near his best. This was also the year that his father died. He returned to Ireland and continued to play tennis. In 1880, he again reached the final of the Irish Tennis Championships, but this time he lost the title to a gentleman named William Renshaw, who later went on to win the Wimbledon Championship 7 times. His tennis fame meant that he would be invited to prestigious social events, but he began to drink and gamble. This lifestyle soon started to have a detrimental effect on his tennis ambitions, and his promising career ended in 1883, when after some defeats, he decided that it was time to stop playing and instead tried to make a living in London. However, life was much the same for him there. He continued to drink and gamble, and his lifestyle continued on somewhat of a downward spiral. He then by chance met a lady named Marie Giraudin. She owned a dressmaker's shop in the upmarket area of Bayswater. She was younger than Vere, having been born in France in 1860. She was a daughter of an ironmonger and had worked in dressmaking since she was very young. She had a reputation as being very skilled at her trade. While in France she had married, however her parents had not cared much for her choice of husband. Their concerns were proved correct, as just 1 week after the marriage, he left her. Feeling ashamed, Marie travelled to Geneva in Switzerland, where she worked in a dressmaker's shop. She later travelled to London, and when she learned that her husband had died, she married a captain in the British Army. But he also died, leaving her a widow for the second time. Although she was an extremely good dressmaker, she was not such a good businesswoman, and her shop was never very successful. Marie and Vere seemed to hit it off. He'd only visited the shop, as he was asked to pay a bill for a relative, but Marie paid him particular attention. The handsome gentleman, from a minor aristocratic family, appealed to her, and they started courting. In 1891, Vere St Leger Gould and Maria Giraudin were married. They continued to live in London, but their love for the finer things in life soon meant that their finances were in a very poor state. They were behind on their rent and had sold all their furniture, so with few options, they decided to leave the city and made their way to Montreal in Canada. This was a new start for them. They would tell people that they were certain Lady Gould. Marie set up a dressmaking shop, and although this was a business she knew well, it seemed that the couple had not learnt anything from their previous experiences and soon started to live beyond their means. They spent very freely, dining at the more expensive restaurants, and Vera would drink and gamble. They were unable to sustain this way of life for very long, and once again managed to exhaust their creditors. It came as no surprise that Vera announced that he had to leave Montreal for a while to return to Ireland. He said that a family member had died. The couple then spent the next 2 years between Canada and England before eventually settling in Liverpool, arriving in 1903. Here they set up a laundry business, but continued with the pretense that they were from a high social standing and told anyone that inquired that they should be referred to as Sir Vere and Lady Gould. The couple continued to try and live a lifestyle more associated with the aristocracy, but by doing this, they continued to get themselves into debt. They tried to devise a way of making a quick fortune, but nothing seemed to work. Eventually, Marie came up with the idea that they should go to Monaco, as she thought that she may have cracked a system which would mean that they would be able to win large amounts of money on the Monte Carlo gambling tables. So in the summer of 1907, they set off to the small principality, situated on a prominent escarpment at the base of the Maritime Alps, along the French Riviera. They continued to call themselves Sir Vere and Lady Gould. They rented the 4th floor of a spacious villa and mixed with the many high society people who spent the summer in Monaco. They had both always been very good at putting on an act. Vere would tell the many ladies and gentlemen he met that the title had passed on to him when his older brother had died in a tragic horse racing accident. Unsurprisingly, this was not actually true, as his brother, Sir Stephen James Gould, was very much alive, but had dropped the title as he had moved to Australia and worked on the railway, and he did not want his fellow workers to know of his noble background. Many people met Vera and Marie in the small principality, but no one seemed to doubt that they were who they said they were, and the couple made sure that they were always courteous, polite and well dressed. Throughout their stay, they were accompanied by Mrs. Gould's niece, a very attractive young lady named Isabel. She would always be seen out with them, and her beauty certainly attracted the attention of young gentlemen, many of whom were very anxious to make her acquaintance. Things, however, were not going well for Mr. and Mrs. St. Leger Gould. When they had first arrived in Monaco, they had some success on the gambling tables, but as days passed, they started to lose money and now found themselves once again in a very poor financial position. They wondered how they would be able to stay in Monaco and started to see if there may be a wealthy patron who would be able to offer them a loan. Marie had always been quite good at persuading people to lend her money. At her dressmaking shop in Bayswater, she often borrowed money from her wealthy clientele, and whilst in Monaco, she had befriended a lady named Emma Levin. Mrs. Levin was a very wealthy widow, originally from Denmark, but who now lived in Stockholm. She was not unlike Marie, having had a difficult upbringing. Her father had abandoned the family home when she was young, and life had been hard for her, until she married a very successful Swedish merchant. Mrs. Levin was a lively character, who very much enjoyed the atmosphere in the Monte Carlo casinos. She was accompanied by a lady named Madame Castellazzi. Marie, however, managed to charm Mrs. Levin, and the two started to spend quite a bit of time in each other's company, much to the displeasure of Madame Castellazzi. Marie always appeared to be an agreeable and caring person, and was able to persuade Mrs. Levin into lending her and her husband 1,000 francs. She said that she was waiting for money to be sent from London. The loan was very much needed, as Mr. and Mrs. Gould had managed to lose all the money they had. With the loan, Vere then returned to the gambling tables, but it did not take long for him to lose all the money they had borrowed off Mrs. Levin. Madame Castellazzi, however, had never been fond of Marie and paid her little attention. Things between the two ladies came to a head when they had an argument in a casino. This soon became a very talked about incident among Monaco's high society visitors, and even appeared in the local press. The incident caused some embarrassment to Mrs. Levin, and she decided that it would be best if she returned to Sweden. Before she left, however, she was anxious to collect the 1,000 francs that she had lent to certain Lady Gould, so on the 4th of August 1907, she went to the couple's rented villa. 5 days later, on the 9th of August, the Goulds arrived at Marseille train station on their route back to London. They requested that their large trunk be put in the station storage department while they went to eat at a local hotel. One of the porters noticed that blood was dripping from it. The porter had seen many things since he had started working at the station, but this caused him much concern. He asked the gentleman why blood was coming from the trunk. Mr. Gould replied that he was transporting dead chickens. The station staff did not seem to be satisfied with the answer and contacted the police. The police arrived and, after a brief conversation with Madame Gould, demanded that the trunk be opened. Inside, they discovered a dismembered female body. In Monaco, Madame Castellazzi had informed the authorities that Mrs. Levin was missing. She told them that she had gone to collect a debt from Sir and Lady Gould and had not returned. The police visited the villa that the Goulds had vacated and discovered that Marie's niece Isabelle was still in residence. Isabelle told the police that her aunt had gone to Marseille, as Mr. Gould needed to see a doctor there. The police inspected the property. Bloodstains were visible, and they came across items that looked very much out of place in a rented holiday villa. There was a saw and a hammer. On closer inspection, the police found that they both had blood on them. In Marseille, the police had arrested the Goulds. They searched them, and in the handbag of Mrs. Marie Gould, they found a large amount of jewellery. It was later identified to have belonged to Mrs. Levin. At first, the couple told the police that Mrs. Levin had a lover who had killed her in their villa in a jealous rage. They said that they were stunned by what had happened, and without thinking properly, they believed that if they told the police, they would be implicated in the crime, so instead decided to dispose of the body. They did this by dismembering it and placing it in the trunk. The police listened to their story, but did not believe it, and arrested both Mr. and Mrs. Gould. They charged them with murder. Vere, however, always considered himself to be a gentleman, and told the authorities that it was actually himself that had committed the murder, and that his wife had had nothing to do with it. He said that he had acted alone. The police were very sceptical of his confession. Their investigation had led them to believe that it was in fact his wife Marie who had arranged the whole thing, and that she had encouraged her husband to do away with Mrs. Levin. They also wondered if she may have had something to do with the death of her first two husbands. The trial began in Monaco's Palais de Justice in December 1907 and became a press sensation. There was interest from all over the world. Many newspapers ran the headline, "The Monte Carlo Trunk Murder." The case had everything that the press believed would fascinate the public: a dismembered body of a wealthy widow found in a trunk, the accused being a previous tennis champion and Wimbledon finalist, along with his wife, who dreamed of a high society life but had never had the means to obtain it. Vere St. Leger Gould again tried to take full responsibility, something his wife seemed happy for him to do, but the court and the press would have none of it. Marie often sobbed during the trial, and her behaviour throughout seemed quite exaggerated, seemingly overcome on occasions and almost fainting. It was apparent that the public and the press believed that she was the mastermind behind the whole event, coming to Monte Carlo in an attempt to win a fortune, borrowing money from Mrs. Levin and then doing away with her and stealing her jewellery. The trial was a short affair, and both Mr. Vere St. Leger Gould and his wife were found guilty. However, in a very strange turn of events, the court decided that Marie was in fact more guilty, having believed that she had planned the crime, and while her husband was sentenced to life in prison, she was to be executed by the guillotine. This was strange, as the Monaco government did not actually possess either a guillotine or an executioner, and not wanting to execute a woman, her sentence was later commuted to life in prison. Vere was sent to Devil's Island in French Guiana. The 1879 Wimbledon finalist, who came from a well-respected family, was to live out his life in a prison on a rocky island in the North Atlantic Ocean, a prison that had been established by Emperor Napoleon's government in 1852. He was, however, only there for a short period, as his health deteriorated, and on the 8th of September 1909, he took his own life. He was 55 years old. Marie was sent to Montpellier prison, where in 1914 she caught typhoid fever and died. The third case is from 1930s Australia. There is an old adage that truth is stranger than fiction, but what about when fiction is what inspires the reality? Perth in Western Australia is a vast and rural landscape. In the late 1800s through to the early 1900s, thousands of prospectors travelled to the region, hoping to strike it rich in the booming gold mining industry. In just one decade, the population had tripled, and the city was totally transformed from a once rudimentary and quiet place to a modern and stylish city. The landscape around the city remained wild and desolate, though undoubtedly rich and fertile. While the crops and livestock thrived, pests and vermin did too. The worst offenders were rabbits, which were known to destroy entire crops in just a few days. It was nearly impossible to predict where the rabbits would strike next, so in 1901, a decision was made to build what became known as the rabbit-proof fence. This would be a 2,023-mile fence, designed to keep out rabbits and other pests in order to protect the booming agricultural industry of Western Australia. Whilst the fence took nearly 50 years to completely finish, sections were completed bit by bit. Maintenance was going to be the key factor in the success of the fence, so men were offered employment as fence boundary riders. Given the fence was so vast, their responsibility was to monitor the integrity of it, making repairs as they travelled and replacing posts if needed. Boundary riders would terminate the colonies of rabbits they found and advise surrounding property owners of any unwanted activity around their land. Whilst initially the men worked alone, by the late 1920s, the riders began inspecting the fence in pairs in a carriage pulled by 2 camels. Thus our story begins in 1929, with 2 riders working as a team on the rabbit-proof fence. Arthur Upfield and George Ritchie had worked together for a number of years and enjoyed the tranquility of the vast open spaces surrounding the fence. Arthur was a writer who often used a desolate landscape as a backdrop for the stories he wrote. He had already written 3 novels of varying success and was working on the storyline of his 4th, but his plot had come unstuck when trying to figure out how to write a convincing storyline where the lead character, whose name was Detective Boney, would convict a murderer despite there being no body. In other words, he was trying to write the story of a perfect murder, one where the perpetrator commits the heinous act and is able to destroy the remains of his victim, but he couldn't figure out how exactly a person would get rid of a body so completely. While they worked on the fence, Arthur and George would discuss the problem and test their ideas for a perfect way to dispose of a body. It took many months of theories before George suggested a method that he believed would achieve exactly what Arthur needed the villain of his story to undertake. George suggested, once the murder had been committed, that the murderer burn the body alongside the remains of a large animal such as a kangaroo. After the burning, the killer would sift through the ashes to find any large chunks of bone or metal. He suggested dissolving the metal in acid and grinding the bone fragments into dust. The dust would then be scattered in the wind, which would remove any traces of there ever being a murder to begin with. Arthur was ecstatic that appeared to have found a solution to his complex storyline plans. But there was one problem. The method was so perfect that there would be no way for Detective Boney to even detect a murder had occurred. This would mean that Arthur couldn't use this in his story. He challenged George to find a flaw in the method, which would mean that Detective Boney would be able to solve the case. But even with the £1 on offer, George could find no such flaw. Arthur didn't want to give up on his storyline, so he began discussing the method with other fence boundary riders as they went about their inspections. He was hoping that someone would come up with the means to make the method usable for his novel. It was during one of these discussions that a Mr. Snowy Rolls came to hear of the technique George had proposed. Snowy Rolls was born John Thomas Smith in Perth in the year 1905. Not much is known about his history until 1928, when he was arrested for theft. He served 3 months in jail before he managed to escape from his local lockup. Upon his escape, he assumed the name Snowy Rolls and took up work on the rabbit-proof fence as a means to avoid suspicion and risk being returned to jail. Snowy was well known to both Arthur and George and seemed excited to be involved in helping Arthur find a solution for his problem. On the 5th of October 1929, George Arthur Snowy and a couple of other boundary riders were all enjoying a meal at the Camel homestead when the topic of the murder method for Arthur's book was discussed again. Arthur had still not decided on a way that he could use the method, given that it appeared too perfect. Still, the men attempted to help, discussing different options they thought that Arthur might be able to use. The next day they set off on their patrols, with Arthur still perplexed as how to incorporate the method into his novel. In December the same year, Snowy stopped at the Camel station again, this time with two other riders named James Ryan and George Lloyd. They departed the station together on the 8th of December. A week later, George Ritchie arrived at the Camel station and told the other riders that he'd met a prospector called James Yates. James had told George that he'd seen Snowy driving a car, which was quite unusual, given most riders travelled by camel or carriage. Snowy told the prospector that James Ryan and George Lloyd were walking in the surrounding scrub, though he never actually saw them himself. A couple of weeks later, on Christmas Eve, Arthur met Snowy in the small town of You and Me. When Arthur asked about the car he was driving, Snowy claimed John Ryan had lent it to him, as he had decided to stay in Mount Magnet rather than travel onwards with Snowy. Strangely though, he told another person that he had bought James Ryan's car off him for the sum of £80. Christmas and New Year passed, and a New Zealander by the name of Louis Caron arrived into the Murchison area. Louis landed a job at the Widgie station, which was one of the stations alongside the rabbit-proof fence. He met many boundary riders whilst working there, who often told him many stories of the long days protecting the fence. Louis was born Leslie George Brown, and like Snowy, he had assumed a new name as he endeavoured to start a new chapter in his life. But unlike Snowy, Louis's life had been rather mundane. He was born and raised in New Zealand, and after a few years of marriage, he had travelled to Perth with a friend, hoping to strike it rich as a prospector. When that didn't work out, he accepted the job at the Widgie station, hoping that in good time his fortunes would change. While Louis travelled, he kept in regular correspondence with his friends, and frequently sent letters describing the experiences he was having in Australia. So it came as a surprise when his regular correspondence abruptly stopped in May of 1930. Immediately, they suspected something untoward had happened to Louis and contacted the local police. Given the area where Louis worked and the large transient population, police initially downplayed the suggestion of foul play. This was until they realised that James Lloyd and George Ryan were also missing, having not been seen since the day in December when they left the Camel station with Snowy. And with word from Louis's employer that he too had last been seen in the company of Snowy Rolls, police began to suspect that harm had come to one or all of the men. Detective Sergeant Manning was heading the investigation and knew of Arthur's attempt to find a murder method for his latest novel. He also knew that Snowy was well aware of the method. Hoping for the best, but suspecting the worst, he decided to bring in Snowy for questioning. As soon as Detective Manning arrived to question Snowy Rolls, he recognised him as John Thomas Smith, the burglar who had escaped custody back in 1928. The detective arrested him on the spot and sent him back to prison. This gave the police more time to investigate the disappearance of Louis Caron, James Lloyd and George Ryan. The evidence against Snowy was adding up. Not only was he the last person to be seen with Louis, Snowy had also cashed Louis's paycheck weeks after he had last been seen. It was well known that Snowy had been interested in hearing about the murder method during the conversation at the Camel Station homestead in the previous October, and the circumstances around the vehicle Snowy had been driving around Christmas was also suspicious. But no remains had been found, so how could they prove that any of the men were actually dead? The answer to this question may never have been known had it not been for a rider who had been patrolling near the 183-mile hut alongside the rabbit-proof fence. During his patrol, he had found an indication of a large fire in the hut, and amongst the dust and ash was a man's wedding ring. The rider who knew of Louis's disappearance and of the murder method which had been discussed for months, he contacted the police and let them know what he had found. The ring was later identified as Louis's, due to an error that a jeweller had made when it was resized a number of years earlier. The jeweller had used a wrong carat of gold to solder the ends of the ring together, giving it a distinctive mark and meaning that it was most certainly Louis's. The ring proved as confirmation that Louis had been murdered, and the ashes in the hut were likely to be all that remained of his body. The fire also confirmed that the murderer had used the method suggested for Arthur's book. The police were sure that Snowy Rolls was responsible, and he was charged with murder. His trial began on the 10th of March 1932 and was presided over by Judge Percy Draper. The case of the murder without a body was causing quite a sensation in Western Australia, and the public were very intrigued by the case. Snowy had been a well-liked member of the Fence Boundary Riders, and although it was well known that some of the workers had dubious pasts and would suddenly disappear, usually to escape being arrested for some previous misdemeanour, 3 boundary workers disappearing at the same time did seem very suspicious. Witnesses in the trial included the pathologist, who told the court that the bone fragments and the tooth found were without doubt human. Louis Caron's dentist and the jeweller who repaired the wedding ring also gave evidence. Arthur Upfield described the murder plots and told the court of how Snowy would try to help in finding a flaw in it so he would be able to finish his book. Snowy Rolls took the stand in his own defence. He denied that he had murdered Louis Caron and said that he did not know why he had decided to disappear or where he may have gone. On the 19th of March 1932, Snowy Rolls was found guilty of the willful murder of Louis Caron. For his crime, he was sentenced to death. Asked if he had anything to say about his conviction, Snowy replied, "Only this. I have been found guilty of a crime that has never been committed." He was later hanged at Fremantle Prison on the 13th of June 1932. As for James Lloyd and George Ryan, they were never seen again, and their remains were never found. It appears that Snowy Rolls followed the method proposed for Arthur's book precisely, but we will never know what made him overlook the crucial step of sifting the remains and dissolving the metals in acid when he murdered Louis. Snowy was never charged in relation to the other men's disappearances. Arthur Upfield went on to use the suggested method for his novel, The Sands of Windee, and later he also wrote a non-fiction book based on the actual murders, called the Murchison Murders. The fourth case is from England and happened in the late 19th century. Catherine Flanagan was born in Ireland in 1829. Not much is known of her childhood, but she did have at least one sister named Margaret, who was born 14 years later in 1843. When Catherine was still a young girl, her parents left Ireland and came to live in England, settling in Liverpool. In the 1840s, thousands of people arrived in Liverpool from Ireland due to the terrible famine that happened between 1845 and 1849. It was believed that in 1847, around 300,000 people arrived, and by 1851, 25% of Liverpool was Irish-born, and Liverpool was a good place to settle. It was regarded as one of the world's great maritime ports, and at the beginning of the 19th century, it was estimated that up to 40% of global trade passed through the docks. Catherine lived in a poor area, and she was aware that many people who lived close by liked to drink alcohol. Water had to be collected in a bucket from a water pump and brought back to the house. This could be a problem, especially if there wasn't a pump nearby. These pumps could also be a place where diseases spread, so many of the poorer in the community preferred to drink beer and spirits. Gin was a favourite, as it was especially cheap. With this in mind, Catherine decided to open a beer house. In 1830, Parliament had passed the Beer House Act, which liberalised the regulations governing brewing and the sale of beer. This allowed any ratepayer to brew and sell beer on payment of a licence. The intention of the Act was to increase competition between brewers, lower prices, and encourage people to drink beer instead of strong spirits. It resulted in the opening of thousands of new public houses and small breweries throughout the country. Catherine took advantage of this and opened a beer house near Liverpool docks. It was a very good location to set up such an establishment, as workers would often pop in after a shift. However, Catherine Flanagan's beer house became known to the local constabulary, as it was often frequented by criminals and prostitutes. She also opened on Sundays, which was not permitted. The government was becoming increasingly more concerned over the law and order in the beer houses, so the excise fee was raised to 3 guineas and property qualifications were introduced. But it was not until the Wine and Beer House Act of 1869 came into force, which gave control of the licensing of the beer houses to the local justices, that many establishments started to close, including the beer house, run by Miss Flanagan. Catherine had a reputation for being somewhat careful with what she spent, but now the beer house had closed. She needed to generate an income, so she set herself up as a moneylender. This was often a very lucrative business in Victorian Britain, due to the poor economic conditions of the working class. They suffered from low wages and often irregular incomes. There was also no restriction on money lending, which meant that the moneylenders were able to legitimately charge high interest rates. Although it was not considered a respectable occupation, it was one that was easy for Catherine to start. She would borrow money from local loan offices and then lend small amounts to her neighbours, whose circumstances were such that they were unable to borrow money elsewhere. She would only lend a little at a time, and only to people she knew, but the interest rate she charged made her business quite profitable. Around 1880, Catherine opened a lodging house at 5 Skirving Street in Liverpool. She employed her sister Margaret to help her run it. Skirving Street was one of the places occupied by the poor of the city, and although the housing conditions in many areas were starting to improve, the 19th century had seen a large increase in the number of people migrating to the industrial cities. This meant that families often lived in terrible conditions, and it was not unusual to find a family crammed into one room. Life was very difficult for the poor, many of whom worked long hours in factories for very low wages. At the time, industry was going through a difficult period, as despite Britain being a leading economic power, the country was suffering from the effects of the Long Depression, which had begun in 1873. Businesses were affected by lengthy periods of low and falling profits, as well as price deflation. Liverpool officially became a city in 1880, by which time the population had grown to more than 600,000. With the problems in the economy, there was an increased demand for cheap accommodation. Catherine and Margaret, along with Catherine's 22-year-old son named John, started the lodging house. It was easy for the sisters to find suitable tenants, and by the winter of the same year, their lodging house was full. One room was occupied by a gentleman named Thomas Higgins and his daughter named Mary. The other room was occupied by a gentleman named Patrick Jennings, along with his daughter named Maggie. Despite the poor living conditions offered, the lodging house meant that the sisters were able to live a modest life. Catherine's son John was 22 years old and seemed like a fit young man, even though his mother would tell anyone that inquired that he was in poor health. Nevertheless, it was a surprise to many when the young man died suddenly in December 1880. Following the death of her son, Catherine was paid £71, as John had been registered with the Burial Society. Although no one had ever seen him unwell, there was no reason to believe that his demise was due to anything untoward. In 1882, Margaret Flanagan and Thomas Higgins started a relationship. They married in the same year, but within just a few months of the wedding, Thomas's 8-year-old daughter named Mary became ill and died. Just like Catherine had done following the death of her son 2 years earlier, her sister Margaret was able to collect a payment from the Burial Society. This time, the amount totalled £22. It was quite common for the poor to pay to be members of a burial society, as they did not want a loved one to receive a pauper's funeral. Just a couple of months later, in January 1883, Maggie Jennings, the daughter of Mr. Patrick Jennings, the other tenant at the lodging house, also died. She was 19 years old, and although her death was unexpected, the impoverished conditions that many people experienced in Victorian Britain meant that the sudden death of a seemingly healthy person was not uncommon, as well as poor housing and sanitation, which often resulted in outbreaks of typhoid. The harsh working environment following the Industrial Revolution had brought many unwanted diseases. Medical professionals had reported seeing an increase in various lung conditions, many caused by breathing dust and fine particles produced in factories. The life of Maggie Jennings was also insured through the Burial Society, and the money received following her death was collected by Catherine. Now 3 people had died in the small lodging house, and it had not gone unnoticed by the residents of Skirving Street. In fact, it was becoming the main topic of conversation. Although they too had all witnessed death and hardship, a child and 2 seemingly healthy young adults dying in one house did seem strange. Not wanting to be the subject of local gossip, the sisters moved their establishments, first to 105 Latimer Street, and then to 27 Ascot Street. But death would follow them. In September 1883, Margaret's husband Thomas Higgins became ill. He was 45 years old and a hard-working man who brought money into the household. A doctor named Dr. Whitford was called, and he concluded that the mysterious illness was nothing more than dysentery caused by drinking cheap whiskey. He told the patient to stop drinking and prescribed a mixture of opium and castor oil. His wife Margaret stayed by his side, but just 2 days later, on the 22nd of October 1883, Thomas Higgins died. Dr. Whitford concluded that the cause of death was dysentery. However, Thomas Higgins' brother Patrick was surprised to hear that Thomas had died. He knew that his brother had enjoyed good health throughout his life, and his sudden death seemed very strange. Thomas had previously told Patrick that a doctor had come to the house with an insurance agent, as Catherine and Margaret had wanted to take a life insurance policy out against him for the value of £50. As £50 was such a large amount, it was usual for a doctor to first examine the person whose life was to be insured. Thomas, however, had refused to cooperate. Patrick decided to investigate his brother's mysterious death and soon discovered that Thomas had been insured with 5 different burial societies, from which his wife Margaret was paid a total of £108. Thinking something was not quite right, he contacted the police. The police agreed to investigate, and on the day of the funeral, a police constable, a coroner's officer, and 2 doctors were sent to 27 Ascot Street. When they arrived, there were people in the small front room around the coffin. Some were drinking, and the constable noted that there was little evidence that anyone was grieving the loss of poor Thomas Higgins. The coroner informed Margaret that the funeral would not be going ahead, as a post-mortem needed to be conducted. Catherine Flanagan said nothing and quickly left the house through the back door. When the autopsy was completed, it was found that high levels of arsenic were present in the body of Mr. Higgins. The coroner stated that evidence suggested that due to the amount of arsenic found, it could be concluded that the deceased had been poisoned over a period of several days. When the police searched 27 Ascot Street, they found a bottle containing a mysterious white substance, which was later confirmed to be arsenic. The presence of arsenic was also found in the pocket of a coat worn by the deceased man's widow, Margaret Higgins. She was then arrested. Meanwhile, Catherine was hiding from the authorities. She moved from one boarding house to another. Strangely, however, she made no attempt to leave the city. After a week of trying to avoid detection, she was seen and subsequently arrested. On the 16th of October 1883, the sisters, Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins, were formally charged with the murder of Mr. Thomas Higgins. There were, however, 3 other people who had died while living in the lodging house, and the magistrate granted permission for the authorities to exhume the bodies of Maggie Jennings, Catherine's son John, and 8-year-old Mary Higgins. John's body was found to be in a good state, with large amounts of arsenic present in it. The same was found with the bodies of Maggie Jennings and little Mary Higgins. All 3 had died from arsenic poisoning, and their lives had been insured through the burial society. Now armed with the evidence that Thomas Higgins, his daughter Mary, Catherine's son John, and Maggie Jennings had all died by poisoning, the detectives presented their findings to the sisters. While Margaret became quite evasive, Catherine told the police that it was her sister that had been the instigator of the crimes. The investigators, however, were unsure how the pair had been able to obtain the poison. They had assumed that they had used rat poison, but when the common adulterants used in rat poison failed to show up at the autopsies, the detectives were quite baffled. Both Catherine and Margaret were illiterate, and their names had not appeared in the poison registers of any local chemists. When the detectives asked Catherine, she told the officers that Margaret had extracted the poison from flypapers. She added that she would be willing to be a prosecution witness against her sister, an interesting offer, but one that the Crown decided not to accept. The trial of the sisters, Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins began at Liverpool St George's Hall on Thursday the 14th of February 1884 before Mr Justice Butt and lasted for 3 days. The case for the murder of Thomas Higgins was heard first, and the evidence against the defendants was convincing. When the trial ended, it took the jury just 50 minutes to find them both guilty, and the judge sentenced them to death. On hearing the verdict, Margaret collapsed in the dock. As they had been given the most severe punishment available, the Crown did not proceed with the case against them for the murders of John Flanagan, Maggie Jennings, and Mary Higgins. The sisters were then sent back to the Kirkdale prison to await their fates. They were held in separate cells and were attended by the prison chaplain. As they were both illiterate, the prison guards read to them. In the hope that she may have her sentence commuted, Catherine spoke to detectives and gave them the names of other women who she said were responsible for other poisonings in the area. While her statement was taken seriously and the police did investigate her claims, they were unable to obtain sufficient evidence to substantiate them. The prosecuting solicitor for Liverpool, a gentleman named William Marks, then wrote to the Director of Public Prosecutions, informing him that he believed that there were probably more victims who had died by poisoning, but it would be very difficult to prove who, other than Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins, could have been responsible for these deaths. Following this decision, there would be no reprieve for Catherine, and at 8 a.m, on Monday the 3rd of March 1884, on a very cold and snowy morning, 55-year-old Catherine Flanagan and her sister, 41-year-old Margaret Higgins, were hanged. In spite of the bad weather, a large crowd had gathered outside to see the black flag raised. Since 1868, the public had not been allowed inside a prison to witness capital punishment being carried out. The police continued to investigate Catherine's claims. She had alleged that other women had been involved in poisoning people in order to obtain insurance payments, and she had given the names of Margaret Evans and Bridget Begley. She also said that Margaret Potter, Bridget Stanton, and Mrs. Fallon worked as agents for the Burial Society, and there was another accomplice named Catherine Ryan. Although it was discovered that Mrs. Stanton did have close links to the insurance payouts of some people who had died, charges were never brought against her or any of the other ladies named in Catherine Flanagan's statement. Well done to all of you who have got to the end of this compilation. I'd like to thank you all for your support during 2023 and for all the comments and feedback you have left. I would also like to know in the comments if you would like me to do a few more compilations similar to this one. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case